All right, welcome to all. So good to see you here. You're giving up valuable time from your day to participate in this exercise in American history on the Vice Presidency of the United States. This is the third cycle on the Vice Presidency. The first cycle was dedicated to the early 19th century, second cycle to the Vice Presidents during the Civil War. And the third cycle, the one we begin today, is about the Vice Presidents of the 20th century. We will begin with a very abbreviated review of what we began with, which is an overall view of the history of the Vice Presidency. And then we'll go on to Charles Curtis. That you will see is a very unusual and remarkable person. The origin of this class actually began in the last 3 years. Why? Because of the criticism under which the current Vice President came, particularly when it was said that she did not do anything. So even though you may or may not agree with her politics, which is totally aside, it's not the issue. The issue was, what are they expecting her to do? And that remains a question that has been asked in similar previous sessions. What do we, as the public, what do we expect the Vice President to do? Hi, welcome. What do we expect the Vice President to do? And we will see what the Constitution specifies for the Vice President and what has developed over time on an extra-constitutional basis. That is, a lot of the things that we expect the Vice President to do are not in the Constitution. They're not on his or her job description. These are things that have developed over time in order to satisfy either the public or the individual himself or herself. So let's begin with a quick review of the history. Please feel free to interrupt at any time. Please let us have your comments and your thoughts, and please speak up, because I am hard of hearing. What? Hard of hearing. Sorry. All right, you get the idea. So let's see. Seal of the Vice President. And this reviews how the original United States decided to become independent and plan for a confederation, but particularly to make plans for a new government. That was one of the ideas. And the Articles of Confederation were approved only 4 years after they were submitted to the states. What does that mean? They were not in agreement. This agreement has always been part of the national landscape. That's why there were 13 colonies. Otherwise, there would have been one colony. There were 13 colonies because they could not agree on many, many things. So the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified, but they were terrible. They did not solve any problems, and rather created more. There was a problem with taxation, because the Confederation government could not tax the states or the individuals. This business of the government, the IRS, for example, taxing you and you and you and me is new. This did not exist when the nation developed. This business of government taxing individuals directly over the power of the states is a modern development. Trade and commerce, the Confederation government had no power, no national military, only one vote per state. So the big states said, hey, we have more people, but we only have one vote. Small states would say, we have one vote, even though we don't have as many people. So there was a certain unfairness there. There were no national courts, and there was no executive branch. There was no real president or executive of the United States early on. So there was nobody to enforce the laws, whatever laws the Confederation government passed. So for that reason, they met in Philadelphia after trying out in an Annapolis conference. This is a very interesting conference about, it was mostly about the Chesapeake. The conflict that the states had in 1785 or so were mostly about fishing, about ports, about traveling along the Chesapeake. And they decided, particularly Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and the like, to get together in Annapolis to try to work things out, because they were having fights over who had possession or power over the waters of the Chesapeake. Well, half of the delegates that were sent to Annapolis never arrived. They probably got lost in the milk carriers. But they never arrived. And even Maryland, that hosted the conference, didn't send any delegates. Maryland said, oh, we need a conference. They didn't send any delegates. In any event, the end result was that the conference said, look, we have problems. We need to call a general conference someplace, not in Annapolis, someplace where there is good food, where there are good hotel rooms, where there is good entertainment, where there's plenty to drink, where there are escorts, where there are other museums and whatnot. So let's all go to Las Vegas. But instead they went to Philadelphia. And then there they found all those things. And at the Philadelphia State House, now where the Liberty Bell and the Independence Park is, the group was 75 men that were appointed as delegates, but only 55 attended. Some people attended the first session, left, and never came back. Some people never showed up. By the time it was ready, or they were ready to sign the Constitution, only half were there. So the Constitutional Convention, as much as we worship it, or as much as historians worship the miracle in Philadelphia, has been embellished with all of this legendary charm. They agreed rather rapidly on a number of things, checks and balances, 2 chambers for the legislature, a strong executive, and a judiciary that would be independent of the others. The question about the executives was quite interesting because there were a number of theories. The large states wanted a group as an executive. That was the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan wanted a single individual. That was the small state plan. So eventually they decided to have a single executive, but then they had to figure out how to get that single individual elected, for how long, what powers to give him or her, particularly him, and other powers to give. So some of the options that they considered, and this was all documented by James Madison and another man by the name of Yates, were direct popular votes. They gave up on that right away. Appointment by the Congress, appointment by the state legislatures, appointment by the executives, that is, by the governors of the states. These were all options that were openly discussed and sent to a committee, and the committee brought them back to the whole assembly, and the whole assembly decided it was a committee of the whole. Have you ever sat on a committee of the whole? No, you haven't. It's a trick by which a large group can say, look, we need to have a discussion, but we don't want anybody to write any minutes about it. All right, so the big groups decides we are now a committee of the whole. So the usual rules of order do not apply. They can interrupt each other, they can shout at each other, they can bring up any issues that they want to, and at the same time, no minutes are taken. So there is really no record of what is said. But it opens the door to a general consensus in a more relaxed way. Basically, major companies nowadays, they take their employees and they put them on a cruise ship and go out to sea for a couple of days. It's basically the same thing. It's a more relaxed environment that they can enjoy and come to agreements. So eventually, they decided, after having sacrificed their best options, and that's a problem with compromise. When you compromise, each part sacrifices its best options. So you go for second best. They compromised and said, okay, we need to give everybody a piece of the action here. So they decided to create a group of electors, what we call now the Electoral College, that was selected by the legislatures of the states. The legislatures of the states would be elected by the public, but it was one filter. The next filter would be the Electoral College. In addition to that, and this is very interesting, was that the electors would vote for two individuals. One would be president, the one with the most votes, and the runner-up would be vice president. This took me personally a long time to understand. Why would they vote for two individuals instead of voting for one? We need to get ourselves back into 18th century mind frame. At that time, there were no easy communications. The telegraph was not even invented. So news traveled very slowly. And the North was not aware of what happened in the South and vice versa. The East was not aware of what happened beyond the mountains and vice versa. So people got to know only their local individuals. And each state had their own favorite son. Nowadays, they would have favorite daughters too, or favorite child. In any event, since there was no CNN, there was no Fox, there was no NBC, there was no television, there was no radio, there was no TikTok, there was, all those things were not around at that time. Communications were very, very slow. People knew about each other what they read in the paper. And do you think that newspapers now are ideologically placed? It was even worse in the 18th century. So each newspaper had its own point of view. It was therefore anticipated that that every state would vote for its own favorite son. New York would vote for its favorite son. Georgia would vote for its favorite son. New Hampshire would vote for its favorite son. And who would come ahead? Nobody. There would be 13 candidates, and there would be no winner. So they said, look, these people need to do some research. They need to look into other newspapers. They need to talk, to communicate, write letters to others, and get to know the politicians from other states. This way, since they're voting for two people, they can vote for number one, their favorite son, fine. Number two, somebody outside their state that has national stature. That way, everybody that would be voted for would be an individual worthy of being a national leader. Do we get that idea across? What was the idea of voting for two? Now, they also had been used to having lieutenant governors. Who is the lieutenant governor of Maryland? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I asked or campaign.
You know?
I'm not coming up with her name. She's of Indian descent.
Oh, it's a lady?
Oh, yes.
That shows you how obscure that position is.
What?
It's Miller, it's her last name is Miller.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Therefore, the point we were trying to make was that the colonists were used to having a lieutenant governor. Therefore, having a vice president was nothing new. Having a second in command, somebody that could step in should the top administrator or the top executive die or get sick or move away or get exiled or whatever. So the idea was not novel. It was an old idea to have a number two waiting in the wings to step in should the need arise. So death, resignation, and also to provide stability. When they wrote the Constitution, therefore they gave the vice president very, very little power. Actually, they gave the vice president no power. All of the executive functions were vested in one president of the United States. And that is crystal clear in the Constitution. The vice president was given no executive power. Was given the responsibility of presiding over the Senate, but no votes, unless the vote in the Senate was tied. If the vote in the Senate was tied, then the vice president could break the tie. But the vice president could not vote to produce a tie. If the vote was, for example, 49 to 50, the vice president could not vote to make it 50-50. The vice president could only vote if the vote was tied. And being president of the Senate, the vice president could not participate in debate. That's the role of the president, is to be impartial and not to take sides. The vice president could do very, very little. The other thing that the vice president would do would be preside over the confirmation of votes following an election. And this is what Mr. Pence was doing on January 6th, when there was trouble outside the Capitol. He was presiding over the confirmation of the election, which is one of the few things that is listed as responsibilities of the vice president. You see, therefore, that the office of vice president was given very, very, very little powers. And they knew it. They knew it because they debated it. They debated it extensively. They even debated whether they needed a vice president at all. And eventually they came up with, yeah, let's go with the vice president in order to assure a degree of continuity. A subject that we will visit again. One of the things that they did not count on when they wrote the Constitution was the development of political parties. They thought that people would always think of the best interests of the nation in general and would not be limited in any direction from their own political parties. As it happens, two political parties developed. And I don't mean to insult your intelligence, I just want to review these things because many of these things your grandchildren will ask you. It happens over and over and over again. I always have somebody in these classes say, you know, my grandchildren were asking me about this and that and something else. I said, oh, we just reviewed that in our class. Two parties developed, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party was the party of John Adams, which was based in New England and favored a very strong central government, tariffs. Do I need to remind you what tariffs are? They're the taxes on goods that are imported from the outside. Right now, there's a big debate that one of the candidates is promising 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. This comes up over and over and over again in American history. Tariffs are a big item in American history. They wanted strict immigration policies. The strength of the Federalist Party was in the cities, and they envisioned an urban country, a country made up of cities with a government of the few, small governments. So generally speaking, the Federalist Party was somewhat closer in some respects, not in all respects, in some respects, to what we recognize nowadays as the Republican Party. Somewhat. Not 100%, but somewhat. On the other hand, the Democratic Republican Party was the party of Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton. Where Hamilton was the guy that, without Hamilton, we would not have the musical or the $10 bill. So that's, we owe him a lot. The Democratic Republican Party, and we're talking about the early 19th century, was based in the border states and in the South. Virginia, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the like. They were very much for state sovereignty. The state was superior to the federal government. The federal government was fine, but the federal government, in their point of view, worked as a homeowners association does. Okay, that's a concept to be understood. For them, the federal government was an entity that came before the states, and the states told the federal government, look, you can do this, this, and that. Nothing else. The same way that a group of homeowners goes to the homeowners association and say, this homeowners association can dictate the color of our homes, can make sure that we collect garbage, can arrange for the collection of garbage and also the removal of snow, but nothing else. Everything else belongs to the homeowner. That was generally the same idea of the states and the federal government. The federal government can take care of the Navy, can take care of the currency, can take care of immigration, can take care of this, can take care of that, but nothing else. That was the idea about state sovereignty, which of course nowadays hardly exists. But still, even in this day and age, is still being litigated over and over and over again over a number of things. So the Democratic Republican Party was against protective tariffs, wanted liberal immigration policies, and they envisioned a country of agricultural interests led by the many, not by the few, but by the many. The point is that the founding fathers, the ones who wrote the Constitution or had the Constitution written, did not foresee that this would happen. As long as George Washington was alive, everything went well. George Washington got elected, Adams was elected as number 2 man, Adams was loyal to Washington, he kind of lectured the senators, which he should not have, but otherwise things were fine. The new election comes around in 1796, and what happens? John Adams gets elected president. Thomas Jefferson gets elected vice president. What's wrong with that combination? You can say, wow, it's great. We can have a $3 bill now. They come from different parties, and they have totally different opinions on a number of things. Who wants that with your runner-up? Nobody. Now, Jefferson was a good man. He served well. He was loyal. He carried on his duties respectfully for the welfare of the nation and planned for the elections of 1800, where he would become then president. By then, communications were a little better. And the strategy that the Democratic Republicans used was several-fold. Number one, they went to the electors and said, look, you're an elector, we want you to vote for Jefferson, 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 and Burr, Aaron Burr, B-U-R-R. Understood? Understood. Same thing. Understood? Jefferson and Burr. Jefferson and Burr. Jefferson and Burr. Burr was, even though he was a Democratic Republican, he was from the state of New York. And he was a very shrewd and able attorney and politician. At that time, the legislature in New York was voted in by at-large candidates. That is, candidates can come from anywhere in the states, not just from Brooklyn or from Staten Island or from the Bronx or from Queens or from Albany. They were at-large candidates. So Aaron Burr, even though he was from New York, was a candidate for the Democratic Republicans, and he delivered those votes. He was crucial to the election of Thomas Jefferson. The problem was that when they counted the votes, Burr and Jefferson had the same number of votes. Why? Because they had gone one by one to all the electors and assured that they voted for one and the other. So the best laid plans of mice and men just blew up in their face. The election had to go to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives would vote one state, one vote. One state, one vote. New York, one state. New Hampshire, one vote. One state, one vote, regardless of how large or how small it was. Now, the big problem was that the Congress, specifically the House of Representatives, was in the hands of the other party at that time. So the other party was voting one or the other on candidates coming from the other party. Jefferson and Burr were Democratic Republicans, but the legislature was in the hands of the Federalists. So it took weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and a lot of coming and going and horse trading back and forth to agree that, okay, Jefferson will be president and Aaron Burr will be vice president. Therefore, that problem was again identified, and they said, we have to do something about it. Thus, they came up with the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment is very straightforward. It says, when the electors vote for president and vice president, they will vote for separate individuals. Instead of voting for two at a time, they will vote one for president and one for vice president, which of course solves that problem, but created another problem. And the other problem was that they no longer had to have an individual of caliber to be vice president. Just about anybody would be vice president. So that led to a number of very, very mundane, routine, mediocre individuals being elected vice president in the 19th century. The vice presidency, the office itself, did not require an individual to be of any high caliber. What did they do then? How did they choose a vice president or a vice presidential candidate? Well, they rewarded a senior politician for party service, somebody that had been in the Senate or in the House or had contributed a lot to the party for many years. They said, look, we'll make you vice president for a few years. Would you mind serving in Washington? No, not sure. I'm tired of all of this, committees and whatnot. May I remind you, at that time, the Congress would meet from December through the end of the winter. And sometime in the spring, they would quit, only to return in December. So most of the time, the vice president was away. In fact, one of the individuals that we'll see here in a moment, Richard Johnson, in the 1830s, is known to have taken his oath of office on March 20th. The next day, packed his bags, left for Kentucky, where he ran a saloon for the next 7 months, only to return in December. Why? That's what they did. There was nothing going on in Congress for most of the year. That was life at that time. It was not like nowadays that it seems like the Congress is continuously in motion, in session. So reward a senior politician. The other problem with this is that many of these politicians would get their position not on the basis of popularity, but on the basis of longevity. Some of them would come from a very secure district, and they would be virtually unknown anywhere else. But they had been in the Congress for 20 years, and that had to be recognized, even though they came from a very, very secure seat. The other thing was to, balance geographically or ideologically. That is, if one candidate was very conservative, the vice president should be somewhat liberal. If one candidate was from a northern state, the other one should be from a southern state. If one candidate was from the east, the other one should be from the west. That's the whole idea of trying to balance the ticket. It was much more important or relevant in the early part of the 19th century than nowadays. The other reason that they could use was to neutralize an ambitious politician that was popular with the public, but not with the party. In other words, have this politician paint himself into a corner. Which corner? Corner of the vice president. And that's what happened, for example, with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a very ambitious politician, was very popular with the people, was not that popular with the party. So they said, what are we going to do with TR? Ha, let's make him vice president. That way, we can write him off. Well, it did not work out that way, did it? So that was the whole idea. Another idea of why appoint somebody vice president. Also secure the electoral vote of a key state, just like Aaron Burr did in New York. There is a theory that Spiro Agnew, when he ran with Richard Nixon in 1968, he helped deliver 4 states with 20 electoral votes that tipped the election. We will touch on that later on. So this has some validity. And the other very cynical theory, which is operative in today's day and age, is that a meaningless or a weak vice president can be considered insurance against impeachment by the president. And this happened with Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln when Lincoln got assassinated. Andrew Johnson was impeached for a number of somewhat invalid reasons, but it came to one vote in the Senate. One more vote and he would have been removed from office. But even though the Senate really disliked Andrew Jackson, the person who would have succeeded him was pretty loathed by the senators. And they said, we cannot get this guy out in order to get that guy in. That is insurance against impeachment. So that has been another cynical reason why the vice president has been chosen, particularly in more recent years. So they were, this is Richard Johnson. There have been a number of attempts at getting the vice presidency out of the Constitution, but they have all failed. The vice president really did not become recitable office until the middle of the 20th century. and various efforts at utilizing the vice president for specific purposes have really not been very successful. The whole idea was why there's nothing in the Constitution that says that a president cannot appoint a vice president, say Secretary of State or Secretary of the Treasury or whatever. The only problem is that the vice president is the only member of the executive branch that cannot be discharged. The president cannot say, "You're fired." It cannot occur. The vice president can be impeached or can be forced to resign, but cannot be fired. So attempts at giving the vice president an office that is a job description with work assigned to it have generally been very unsuccessful. This is a very brief history of the vice president. Calvin Coolidge invited Warren Harding to become a member of the cabinet. Before that, the vice president stayed away from all those meetings. Why? Because it's not in the Constitution. The vice president's office was over there in the Capitol as president of the Senate. Nice office, but still away from the president.
You know, what their thinking was originally that the vice president would succeed should the president die. Wouldn't they want him to know what was going on?
Most of the time, no, they didn't.
Yeah, that's kind of weird they didn't write that in there.
They were isolated.
Yeah.
And this is the same way that lieutenant governors worked in many states. They were totally isolated for from the top executive. So Charles Dawes declined to attend cabinet meetings until finally FDR reestablished the vice president's attendance at regular meetings, but did not tell the vice president everything. For example, when FDR died, Harry Truman had no idea of the A-bomb of the Manhattan Project. He knew something was going on because there was a lot of money going someplace. But those were wartime, some wartime secrets. He really did not know anything about the A-bomb. In 1949, the vice president became a member of the National Security Council only because a law was passed accordingly. This was made by law, not by the Constitution, by law. LBJ finally got offices in the Executive Office Building in 1961. And in 1969, Spiro Agnew, as vice president, was awarded his own budget. Up until that time, they did not have a separate budget. That's how neglected the office of the vice president. No office space, no budget. How about housing? The official residence is at number 1 Observatory Circle. It's a beautiful home. This used to be the official home of the head of the Navy, the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations. And they booted him out after the Second World War, redid the house and gave it to the vice president. Walter Mondale finally got his offices in the West Wing in 1977 and was expected to receive briefings. We will touch this again when we talk about Walter Mondale, but that was his major role in history, was that he advanced the position of the vice president to a point that he was ready to move in as president at just about any time, by design. And this is what he and the president wished. Now, we said a moment ago that there was a movement once upon a time to get rid of the vice presidency. Well, following the assassination of John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson became president, and for 14 months, there was no vice president. Then in 1968, Spiro Agnew was elected. He was re-elected in 72 and resigned in 74. By then, the 25th Amendment had become law, and what was Nelson Rockefeller was, after Gerald Ford, appointed vice president. There were a number of scandals also with the vice presidency. In 1972, Thomas Eagleton was nominated for vice president at the National Convention. And a couple of weeks afterwards, it was disclosed that he had suffered from depression. Not only that he had had electroshock therapy. Electroshock therapy for some of us sounds barbarian, but believe me, it saves lives. Some individuals with major depression need electroshock therapy to bounce out, and it works. Doesn't work all the time, not as good as we would like to, but it certainly has saved many lives. At that time, mental illness was not recognized as it is today. It was really a handicap to have had any kind of mental illness. So Eagleton, who was basically a good man, had to withdraw his candidacy for the vice president. Nevertheless, that was a big scandal. Spiro Agnew resigned in 74, accused of bribery, with very good documentation. I mean, on Spiro, you'll see they had everything but the videotape. They had the case was nailed down, open and shut case. Ford became the first vice president not to be elected, and nominated himself, Nelson Rockefeller, for vice president, who was eventually confirmed. We'll go over these again. So therefore, in the 1970s, a number of scholars and organizations wanted to do away with the vice presidency completely. And a number of plans were considered, including succession. The assassination attempt on Reagan in 1981, however, changed all that. Because the public realized that we do need a vice president ready to go at any moment. So after that, there has not been any more impetus to the idea of doing away with the vice presidency. How about women? Geraldine Ferraro was nominated in 1984 for vice president. Nice lady, good politics, elegant, attractive, charming. Her husband was what we call nowadays a slumlord. He was the owner or partner or confidant to people who owned apartment buildings and other buildings that had some kind of connections with the underworld. So for several weeks in 1984, day after day after day was one more scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal. Like her husband was charged with or accused of having lunch at a restaurant where the night before a group of mafia men had died. He was a businessman, and his businesses, like many businesses in New York, are sometimes kind of iffy. It has to be in order to survive in the world of New York with things like rent control that really sap away your earnings. So that really diverted a lot of attention from the campaign. Then in 2004, Sarah Palin, then governor of Alaska was nominated for vice president. Mrs. Phelan had been on television before, so she knew how to appear before a camera. She was very, very photogenic, a very attractive and charismatic woman. She had absolutely no depth in politics at the national level.
Or mentally. Sorry. Couldn't help that. I said, or mentally.
Of course, they got defeated. The idea behind her nomination was the Republican Party felt that it was already behind in the polls, and they needed to shock the system. That's one of the reasons why she got nominated.
There's a very interesting movie about that. Woody Harrelson stars in it as John McCain.
Right. Now, John McCain knew that he was way, way behind.
Yeah.
And he needed to do something radical. And that's why he chose Mrs. Phelan. Then now Vice President Harris was nominated in 2020, where now President Biden promised a woman of color for the office. Now again, regardless of whether you agree or not with his politics, Richard Cheney was elected vice president in the year 2000. And Cheney brought to the vice president an enormous amount of experience and know-how. You may or may not have agreed with his politics, but he had a lot of political, managerial, and executive experience. He elevated the office to that of a co-president. But he always managed to do it with a certain degree of delicacy. He never usurped the presidency. He always worked through the president and through the president's staff. Going back to that idea of what can the president do to give the vice president something to do, in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt gave Henry Wallace the position of chairman of the Board of Economic Warfare. They were planning for the Second World War, of course, and the Board of Economic Warfare had a number of things to do, including hoarding strategic materials like rubber, manganese. But he very rapidly came in conflict with Donald Nelson, Cordell Hull, and Secretary of Commerce Jesse Jones, otherwise known as Jesse Jesus Jones. Eventually, several of these men had to resign, and they had to dismantle several of these boards because the conflict was so severe. These were all allies of the president, but they were fighting each other. What were they fighting each other? Power. Power, which really was only the president's. We need to touch on the succession acts. That is, what to do when both the president and the vice president are not there. A double vacancy. This was foreseen in the Constitution. In case of a double vacancy, the Congress has the ability to make laws that will provide for succession. In 1792, the president pro tem, or the temporary president of the Senate, would become acting president until a new president was elected by a special election. That special election has never been used. That special election is not in effect at this time. But there was a provision if both men both positions were vacant, a special election would take place. The problem was that the Speaker of the House would be next in line. And these, both the President of the Senate, the temporary President, and the Speaker of the House could be from different parties, creating a lot of conflict. That was changed in 1866. Number one, the temporary president and the Speaker of the House were excluded, taken off the succession list. And the members of the cabinet were put on the listing, beginning with state, treasury, defense, all the way down the line. Once again, the special election was maintained, was kept, was never used. It was never used. The last revision of the Succession Act came after FDR died. In case of a double vacancy nowadays, the Speaker of the House would be first in line, then the temporary President of the Senate, then the members of the Cabinet. But there is no special election provision. Nowadays, they say a bomb blows up the Congress, and both the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House are killed at a time when there is no Vice President or President, then it's on the members of the Cabinet, going from state, treasury, and the like. But there is no special election. That has been written off. This is what some of the former vice presidents commentators have said. The vice president has only one serious thing to do, that is to wait around for the president to die. Very true. John Adams said, I am nothing, but I may be everything. Daniel Webster, I do not propose to be buried until I am really dead and in my coffin. That's what he said when he was offered to be vice president. Next will be Woodrow Wilson. The importance of the vice president consists in the fact that he may cease to be vice president and, of course, become president. Teddy Roosevelt said, it is not a stepping stone to anything except oblivion. John Nance Garner, that we will discuss, said that the vice president is not worth a bucket of warm kiss. That's what he actually said. The press changed that to warm spit. That's the title of this exercise. He also felt that the vice president was a spare tire in the automobile of government. Okay. Not fast.
Not going?
Neither forward nor backwards. That's part of the course.
There you go.
There we are. This is another, Truman felt that the vice president was an officer of the executive branch. And Hubert Humphrey said it's like being naked in the middle of a blizzard. Coming from Minnesota, he knew. With no one to offer you a match to keep you warm. You're trapped, vulnerable, and alone. Hubert Humphrey was really abused by LBJ as vice president. It was really treated like dirt. The press ignored those things, but he was really very meanly treated. We can go on to the next set of slides now, please.
Can we go back to the one thing you said earlier it wasn't until Reagan was shot and wounded, not killed, of course, that the people woke up to the fact that, yes, we do need a vice president.
Right.
I'm surprised that didn't happen a few years earlier after Kennedy was shot and killed, and yes, we needed a vice president.
You're very correct. Probably because everybody was so wounded by the assassination. And probably because LBJ came in being a very strong and decisive person. And the country at that time was in the middle of the civil rights movement. There were so many other issues going on that the vice president was really not that important to the public at that time. That was probably what happened, but there may have been. In fact, it would have been a good time to revisit the position because Lyndon Johnson had a coronary in 1958. So he was already, he was not a healthy man to begin with.
And then somebody in the cabinet at the scene of Reagan's shooting, it was one of the cabinet members, and somebody else probably remembers who it was, said, I'm in charge.
Oh, Al Taylor.
At the White House.
I guess he hadn't read the Constitution.
He probably meant that I am the chief of staff, I am in charge here in the White House. Because Vice President Bush was away from Washington at that time. Was somewhere on an airplane over the Midwest, but he came in right away. And he very rapidly made his presence known. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, let's see how far we can get here with Mr. Charles Curtis. Mr. Curtis was the 31st Vice President of the United States. And he was the first Vice President that was not of pure European background. He was 3/8 Native American, otherwise known as American Indian. But he had been born in a reservation in Kansas in 1860, before Kansas became a state. His grandparents brought him up actually speaking French and a dialect at home. So he spoke French and an Indian dialect before he spoke English. This young man, got awarded a horse, and he learned how to ride bareback. And he became quite a jockey in his youth. He would go around the Midwest riding horses in races and making some money. And eventually he used his horse to run a delivery service. Nowadays he would have been an Uber driver, something like that. He was very, very enterprising young man. He attended Topeka High School. He studied law and was admitted to the bar in 1861 when he was 21 years old. The key thing to remember about Mr. Curtis, clear your cobwebs now, please, because this is important to his understanding, is that Mr. Curtis was dedicated to assimilation and education, because he was the product of education and assimilation. That's the key thing to understand about Charles Curtis and about the whole thing. He was elected to Congress as a young man and re-elected for 6 terms. He was in favor of the Curtis Act that ended tribal land law titles. And he encouraged also Native Americans, American Indians, to accept citizenship, title to their lands, and become more American, become more European Americans. We live in a time when diversity, equity, and inclusion are important. This was the opposite direction. The idea at this time was that migrants or minorities had to become educated in order to blend in. This is the early part of the 20th century. We cannot forget that this was 100, 120 years ago. In order to get ahead, you need to blend in. If you want to remain yourself, you will not blend in, you will not get ahead. Basically, the same argument that was predicated during Reconstruction. Former slaves had to become more like white men in order to make progress. And people believe this honestly. People who were not bigots, who were not KKK, believed that honestly, both in North and the South, that the future was to become homogenized in the mind of the white, or in the image of the white man. Let's talk a little bit more about, okay? Okay, it's all, if we put enough buttons, eventually, good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Assimilation is supposed to be the process by which a dominant culture infuses a dominated culture with its institutions. So the culture that dominates brings its institutions, its habits, its forms of life to the culture that is overwhelmed or dominated. And that is not necessarily wrong. Rome, for example, did that. Rome wanted all of its colonies to be Romanized, and therefore they brought things like the law to all the other countries that they dominated. It can be bad, but it can also be good. Many, like we said before, believe that assimilation was really important for all minorities, not just Native Americans, all minorities, to move ahead. And even though initially it might be rejected, eventually they would become prosperous. They would become wealthy. Their level standard of living would increase, and they would accept assimilation.
I wanted to.
So we all know what your Euro-American structures and habits are, like 3-generation families, patrilineal kinship, where a young person accepts the father's line as the major influence in the family. Different inheritance laws for legitimate versus illegitimate children, male-led households, division of labor, and all the other things, including corporal punishment for children and women, which did not exist in Indian cultures.
That painted a very nice picture.
I'm so sorry.
Not painting a very nice picture of us. You're.
No, no.
Well, it wasn't.
This is exactly what it was.
Yeah, you're great.
This is exactly what it was.
Well, this was the period of colonialism. The British Empire was at its height. White man's burden.
Absolutely. Yes,
White
indeed.
men didn't have a bird and they were.
Forget it, you said like W.E.B. Du Bois, you just said, the white man's burden, one black man had to carry.
And And that was the pointer not working now, or are you ready to move on?
No, I'm trying to move on.
It's weird that.
On the other hand, Native American cultures generally were in favor of self-governance, extended family, matrilineal kinship. That is, the family came down the side of the mother. There was no illegitimacy. All children were the same, legitimate and illegitimate. There were children. Labor was the same. All labor was noble. There was nothing in labor, no kind of labor was demeaning. Religious tradition, worship was very expressive, very outward, while European worship is rather private, separate, individual. Discipline was nonviolence, and land was community owned. There was no private property. The reservations were owned by the group, not by individuals.
Can you imagine if we took on their social structures?
Yeah.
What a lovely place this would be.
Yes.
Try turning it on and off and see, because it still has,
Right to on and on.
right there. Yeah, slide it back toward you and then forward again,
It's off,
and then forward.
it's on,
Give that a try.
I press,
Still nothing.
nothing happens. All right, so there were 4 methods of assimilation that we'll go through rapidly. Please refer to your write-ups for a lot of more details. Allotment, boarding school system, reorganization, and family termination. These were the ways that white men, usually white men in Washington, that never had been to an Indian reservation, that had absolutely no idea of what life was there, decided to use in order to bring the American Indian or the Native American into the mainstream of life. Slide, please.
But it was also in the Catholic Church.
We'll touch on the Catholic Church in a
All right,
second.
don't leave them out.
Allotment was the redistribution of land to recreate, and this was in the law, responsible farmers in the white man's image. That was the idea of allotment. In 1887, the Dawes General Allotment Act was approved, which gave 160 acres of land to each head of household. 160 acres is a lot of land. My understanding is 160 acres is about one half mile on each side of a square, more or less. So it's quite a bit, particularly if you're able to have access to a neighbor's or a relative's allotment. That would make a mile one way and half a mile the other. That's a lot of land. For subsistence, that is just to live, it is estimated that one person can live on 1 acre of land. 1 acre of land, one person. So if say a family decides to move out into the country, a family of 5, it is estimated that they would need at least 5 acres to survive. The rest of food they grow and whatnot, they can sell. But the rule of thumb is 1 acre, 1 person.
One question,
Just please.
1 acre for a vegetarian or a meat eater? There is a huge difference,
Probably mixed. Rather, the estimate is mixed.
because there's a big difference.
Yeah, but they would also have chickens, and they would have hogs, and they would have cows for milk, and they would have goats, and they would also plant grain and plant vegetables and some fruit, if fruit grows. Yeah, it's a, what is your understanding of
I don't
the
have the
situation?
numbers in front of me, I have them at home, but a vegetarian can live on a lot smaller land. If they are eating, the vegetarian is eating, for instance, the wheat, as opposed to feeding that, or the corn, feeding that to the, especially the cow. Dramatically more for the cow, less true for the chicken. But if they're feeding it to those animals and then eating the animals, it takes a lot more land
Yes, of
to
course,
feed one person.
of course.
Also, the quality of the land,
Of course, you know.
No question about it. We'll get to that in a moment. Yes, indeed. Thank you so very much. That was quite interesting. Thank you. Let's see. So the point we were trying to make was that the allotments were quite generous. These individuals had never owned anything. So to go from nothing to 160 acres of land for a homemaker for a household is considerable. It's moved.
Oh, it worked that time, because I clicked it right when you clicked it.
So the idea of the Dawes Act was that after 25 years, the individual who had the land would be granted citizenship, would become a full U.S. citizen, and title to the land. Any land that was not titled that way would be available for sale. Public sale. Of these, 118 reservations were allotted. But unfortunately, 2/3 of the land disposed of this way was acquired by white speculators. And you can be sure that the best land was the land that was sold at auction, not the land that was allotted. So the allotment failed to result in assimilation. The social structure was weakened. Tribes that were nomads, that went from one place to another, they could not adjust to agriculture. They could not adjust to staying in one place. Of course, the owners were swindled out of property and reservations. This is not my backyard, mind you. Were riddled with disease, filth, poverty, despondency, even to this day. Even
Alcohol and drugs. Today, alcohol and drugs.
Yes, and disease. About 90% of individuals in reservations have diabetes. And there is a considerable amount of tuberculosis. Alcoholism is really, really a disease. They just cannot, the gene is not there to tolerate alcohol. All right,
Back to that.
help us on the way. There it is. We can go back to 1819, the Civilization Fund Act, when money was given to religious organizations to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So this process has been going on for a long time. Out of these came the boarding schools. The boarding schools replaced day schools specifically to separate children from their communities and from their families. That was the purpose of the boarding schools. There were about 400 of these boarding schools in the 18th and 19th century, most in Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico. Children stayed there for about 4 years, and they were really teenagers when they entered. And by law, they had to attend the boarding schools. One of the best-known boarding schools was in Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And the children there had to wear Western clothes, not their tribal attire, speak English, not their dialect. They had to convert to Christianity, whether they wanted it or not. They had to have their hair cut in Western style. Discipline was harsh. With so many children, so many adolescents, discipline had to be harsh. There's no question about it. And there was physical and emotional abuse documented. Students had to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, science, and history, art classes, participate in sports, manual labor, trades, skills, survival agriculture, how to survive on a farm, and also military drills. The schools failed to result in assimilation. Most of the students that went to the boarding schools, when they finished their boarding schools, they would not go back to the reservation. If they went back, they eventually moved away. So the main idea that was to create farmers in the classical European American way did not develop. Probably about 500 students died due to disease. At this time, infectious disease were rampant. Typhoid, typhus, there were no antibiotics. So many students died there. And eventually the boarding schools closed in the 1930s.
There was just an explosion in Canada related to boarding schools for Native Americans where they discovered a burial ground of all kinds of unidentified bodies that nobody knew anything about, and exploded across the country, and they all of a sudden began to look at these schools and thought, oh my God, I don't know why it was such a surprise. We've known about this for years.
Yes, yes, indeed. The story about, excuse me.
My understanding was that some of them were pulled away from their families a lot.
Oh,
No,
many
they were. That was the point.
Younger
They got out of their
teenagers,
families.
They would
No
send
more English.
4, 5, 6 years old
Yeah,
and put into these awful.
They had to go to the schools by law. So they would send inspectors to pick up children. And their parents would hide them from the inspectors. They would send them away or put them in the cellar or whatever in order not to be sent to the boarding school. Yes, this is our history. And the history of the Native Canadians is also very, very grim. So it's a chapter totally separate from this. The other things that they used was termination. That is, they finished the agreements between the federal government and the tribes, and also reorganization that really did not work very well. American Indians or Native Americans were given U.S. citizenship officially in 1924. That was the world of Charles Curtis. That's where he came from. That's how he grew up. That's what he was in favor of. He was in favor of education because he had been educated. He was in favor of assimilation because he had been assimilated. He was appointed to the Senate, served many years as President pro tem, and he was certainly a leader in Washington. All right.
Oh, sorry, I keep reading your stuff and then.
Thank you so very much. He was nominated for vice president in 28. He was elected. He, for one thing, he enjoyed being vice president. He enjoyed the public appearances. He enjoyed the ceremonies. He enjoyed having an office in the Capitol. He enjoyed having delegations come to visit him. He enjoyed posing for pictures and wearing the big hats with all the feathers. He did not complain about being vice president. One thing he complained about was not being able to find a house to live in the district. At this time, in the 1920s, the district was very, very racist. People with backgrounds of the Indian culture, blacks, and Jews had a lot of difficulty finding housing in the District of Columbia, or hotels, or the like. I think that Curtis lived in a suite at the Mayflower. But otherwise, blacks, Jews, Indians had a lot of difficulty finding housing in the District of Columbia. This should be a good time to stop, shouldn't it? Yeah. Let's stop here and resume here our next week, finish up with Charles Curtis and go on to the vice presidents during the Depression and the New Deal.